My name is John Wilson, and in 2007 I received an email informing me that Michael Welker had been killed in Afghanistan. I had made a promise to Michael that last time I saw him that if anything should happen to him then I would contact Annie Carson and tell her his story. I suggested that he contact her himself and tell her the story, and he said he couldn't do that. Michael said he couldn't, that it would sound like he was boasting about his actions and his love for her. Besides, he said she has someone and he does not want to interfere in her life or her happiness. So it was best if I waited until after he died. So now I was keeping my promise, and I had to find Annie and tell her Michael's story. He called her the Yellow Rose.
After I performed an internet search, I found a phone number and I dialed that number, and 3 rings later a woman answered and I asked if she was Annie Carson. She said yes, and I said, "Do you remember me? I'm John Wilson." There was a long pause and she said, "Yes, I remember you, John. How are you doing?" And I said, "Fine, but I said the reason I am call you is to ask if you remember a boy from high school named Michael Welker." Again there was a long pause before she said, "Yes, I remember him." I wasn't sure on how to start, so I just said Michael and I were in the army together and we met by accident back in 1990 during the Desert Storm War. I told her we had gone out for a couple of beers and Michael talked about you. If you have the time or later, I would love to tell you a story that you may have never heard before. After another pause, Annie said, "John, the first don't have time right now. And there is a man in a wheelchair and I guess his daughter at my front door. I guess," she said, "he looking for a handout." Then I said, "Let me give you my phone number and my email address, and when you have time call me." After she hung up the phone, I remember Michael's words and I knew things were going to start occurring in Annie's life. It was about a month later when I was sitting at my computer when I heard this bell and I knew I had an income email. I opened the letter and it said, "Hi John, I've tried to call a couple times but your line was busy, so I thought I'd write you. I have a favor to ask. My granddaughter Lauren just turned 16 a few days ago and she asked me if there was ever a boy who fell in love with me. I said of course there was, and then she wanted to know all the details. You remember the story you were going to tell me about Michael Welker, the boy from school? John, you have a better way with words than I do, so if someday you have time, would you mind writing her and telling her the story you were going to tell me? I've put her email below. Thanks John, the first low you won. Annie." I sat there and I read Annie's letter again and I just shook my head. I got up from my chair and walked to the back of my home and I looked out my window. I watched the waterfall as it ran down the hillside into the pond below. I could not believe that Annie wanted me to write story to her granddaughter that she has never heard. My God, where would I start? She doesn't even know what all this story is about. I asked myself, how would I write this? I walk out to the garage and opened a metal file cabinet. I pulled out a cardboard box with cassette tapes and I searched through the titles until I found 3 that I wanted. I took the 3 tapes along with a cassette player and headphones into my office. I plugged the recorder in and put on the headphones on and begins to listen to the audio tape, and then I began to type. I look at the clock on my desk and it was 8 a.m. and I knew it was going to be a long day and probably run late into the night. When I finished the story in the early morning hour of the following day, I emailed it to Lauren. I leaned back in my chair and sat there for the longest time and wonder what is this little 16-year-old girl going to think when she read this long story.
My name is Lauren and I'm Annie's granddaughter. When I turned 16, I asked my grandmother if there was ever a boy in her life that she fell in love with, and she laughed and said of course there was. Well, I wanted to know all the details, but she just said she would tell me at a different time. Then one day I come home from school and I noticed an email from John Wilson and it said, "This is your grandmother's love story." I was hungry and wanted to eat, but once I began the story I could not stop. And then I began to cry as I pictured my grandmother being loved by a man that. There was this guy that I really liked, and I just prayed that one day he would be like Michael and love me the same way. When I asked about a boy in my grandmother's life, I thought she was just going to tell me that she met a boy and they fell in love and they kissed. Oh, I never dreamed my grandmother's story would be so romantic. I wished one day I would meet a boy like Michael who would fall in love with me like that. I called my grandmother and told her that John had sent me an email about her and Michael. I asked Grandma if she remembered when my dad was born. Did she remember that someone had sent her yellow roses anonymously at the hospital? I didn't wait for her answer before I said, do you remember one Christmas when you didn't have a lot of money and then on Christmas Eve you found all these Christmas gifts outside your front door? Grandma says yes. How did you know that? I said, Grandma, do you remember when you worked a restaurant and an old man would come in and order a dime cup of coffee and then give you $100 tip? Grandma said she did remember all of this, but how did I know it? I said, Grandma, all those years when you thought you had a garden angle. But he was really Michael. I said, Grandma, I want a boy like that to fall in love with me. I wish one day I could be loved just like that.